Would you send your own son to prison to save your reputation? Judge Elias Thorne just received a case that will either shatter his career or burn his conscience to ashes. One gavel strike will decide his legacy or his blood. What would you choose? The mahogany desk in Judge Elias Thorne's study felt colder than usual tonight. At 62, Elias was a man defined by the rigid architecture of the law. His reputation in the city was built on a foundation of unyielding impartiality, a trait that had earned him respect, but also a profound, quiet loneliness. Outside, a relentless autumn rain hammered against the window pane, mirroring the turbulence in his chest. Spread before him wasn't a case file from the courthouse, but a grainy, black-and-white photograph sent to his private address an hour ago. It showed a young man, barely 20, leaning against a street lamp. The boy had his mother's defiant eyes Elias hadn't looked into for 2 decades. The boy was Julian, the son Elias had never acknowledged. The letter accompanying the photo was brief and devastating. Julian had been arrested for a hit-and-run that had left a local pediatrician in a coma. The evidence was circumstantial but damning. Then came the dilemma. The case had been assigned to Elias' own courtroom due to a clerical oversight in the busy district. He could recuse himself, as the law demanded, and let a stranger decide the boy's fate, or he could stay. If he stayed, he could subtly steer the proceedings toward an acquittal, protecting the bloodline he had once abandoned. But to do so would shatter the one thing Elias valued more than life itself, his integrity. He poured a glass of scotch, the amber liquid trembling slightly. If he stepped down, the presiding judge would likely be Sarah Jenkins, a woman known for maximum sentencing as a political statement. Julian wouldn't stand a chance. Elias picked up the phone. His finger hovered over the number for the clerk of courts. One call could save his soul, or one silence could save his son. While the city mourned the comatose pediatrician, Julian's case wasn't the only shadow looming over the district. Marcus Vane, a 60-year-old structural engineer who had built half the skyline, stood on the balcony of his penthouse. His hands, weathered by decades of blueprints and site visits, were white-knuckled against the railing. Marcus was a man of precision, a man who believed that if the math was right, the world stayed upright. But tonight, the math was failing him. A whistleblower from his firm had sent him an encrypted file. It contained data on the Ascent Tower, a luxury residential skyscraper Marcus had completed 5 years ago. The alloy used in the primary support beams was degrading at a rate 3 times faster than projected. It was a manufacturing defect he had missed during the high-pressure construction phase. The building was stable for now, but in a decade, perhaps less, a severe earthquake or even a heavy gale could cause a catastrophic structural failure. Hundreds of families lived in that tower. Marcus faced a choice that felt like a slow-motion car crash. If he went public, his firm would go bankrupt, his legacy would be incinerated, and he would likely face criminal negligence charges. If he stayed silent, he could spend the next few years quietly funneling his personal fortune into maintenance projects to reinforce the beams without anyone knowing why. However, the reinforcement would take years. If a disaster struck tomorrow, the blood would be on his hands. His daughter, Clara, had just bought a condo on the 42nd floor. She was pregnant with his first grandchild. He hadn't told her. Telling her meant telling the world. Marcus looked at the city lights, each one representing a life he held in a fragile, crumbling grip. Across town, in the sterile silence of St. Jude's Hospital, Dr. Alina Vance sat in the darkened cafeteria. The pediatrician from the hit-and-run, Dr. Eris Thorne, was her colleague and friend. He lay in room 402, brain-dead, kept alive only by a rhythmic bellows of a ventilator. Alina was the laid transplant surgeon. She had just received an urgent notification. A prominent senator, a man who held the tie-breaking vote on a health care bill that would provide insurance to millions of impoverished children, was dying of liver failure. He had 6 hours to live. Eris was an organ donor. His liver was a perfect match for the senator. The moral gears began to grind. The legal protocol for declaring brain death was strict, and Eris hadn't quite met the final criteria. There was a microscopic glimmer of neurological activity, a 1 in a million chance of recovery. If Alina waited the required 24 hours to see if Eris woke up, the senator would die. If the senator died, the bill would fail, and thousands of children would lose their medical safety net. Alina looked at her hands. They were designed to save, yet here she was, calculating the value of 1 life against 1,000,000. Eris would have wanted the children saved. He was a pediatrician, after all. But to harvest his organs now was, by the letter of the law, murder. She stood up and headed toward the intensive care unit. The hallway felt miles long. She saw Eris's wife, a woman named Lydia, weeping in the waiting room. Lydia believed in miracles. Alina believed in statistics. As she reached the door, she realized that being a hero often required becoming a villain in the eyes of the law. While the hospital corridors remained hushed, Julian's trial began to leak into the public consciousness. Thomas "Tom" Vance, a seasoned investigative journalist nearing retirement, sat in a dimly lit office. His eyes, tired from 40 years of chasing truth, were fixed on a whistleblower's envelope. Inside were documents suggesting that the hit-and-run involving the pediatrician wasn't an accident. They pointed to a larger conspiracy involving a local construction conglomerate. Tom had spent his career winning awards for exposing corruption, but his personal life was a wreck. His daughter, Dr. Alina Vance, the surgeon currently deciding the senator's fate, was his only bridge to a meaningful legacy. He knew that if he published this story now, it would implicate the very hospital where Alina worked, suggesting they were being pressured to speed up organ donations to save the senator and bury the truth about the crash. The moral trap was closing. If Tom broke the story, he would likely save Julian, an innocent boy caught in a corporate web. But the scandal would destroy Alina's career and the hospital's reputation, potentially killing the healthcare bill the senator supported. Tom's phone buzzed. It was a text from Alina, simply saying, "I'm making a hard choice tonight, Dad. I hope you're proud." He looked at the draft of his article. One click would change the lives of everyone in the city. He felt the phantom weight of 1,000 eyes watching him. Tom realized that the truth wasn't a static thing. It was a weapon that could heal or bleed. He had to decide if he was a father first or a journalist. The clock on the wall ticked with the same rhythm as the ventilator in room 402. Deep within the county jail, Silas Thorne, a veteran corrections officer with 30 years of service, watched Julian through a grainy monitor. Silas was a man of quiet faith and rigid routine. He was also the estranged brother of Judge Elias Thorne. They hadn't spoken since their father's funeral, a rift caused by Silas's refusal to look the other way regarding a family legal matter decades ago. Tonight, Silas overheard a conversation between two high-ranking inmates. They were planning to neutralize Julian before he could testify about what he saw the night of the crash. The hit had been ordered from the outside by someone with deep pockets and a vested interest in the Ascent Tower project. Silas knew that if he reported this to his superiors, the bureaucracy would take hours Julian didn't have. Silas could move Julian to solitary for his own protection, but doing so without a formal order was a breach of protocol that would cost Silas his pension just months before retirement. His wife was ill. They needed that money for her treatments. He stood at the heavy iron gate, his keys jingling like a funeral bell. To his left was the path to safety and poverty. To his right was the path to a comfortable retirement and a dead boy on his conscience. Silas thought of his brother, the judge, and wondered if Elias was currently wrestling with the same ghosts. He realized that the Thorne family was built on secrets, and tonight he was the one holding the shovel. Lydia, the wife of the comatose pediatrician Aris, sat in the hospital chapel. Her world had collapsed in a single moment of screeching tires. A man in a tailored charcoal suit, Mr. Sterling, approached her. He didn't look like a doctor or a lawyer, he looked like a fixer. He spoke in a low, soothing voice that set Lydia's nerves on edge. Sterling offered her a deal. If she signed the consent forms for the organ donation immediately, bypassing the final neurological checks, a charitable foundation would pay off her mortgage, fund her children's college education, and ensure she never wanted for anything again. The catch, she had to agree to sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding the circumstances of Aris's death and the timing of the procedure. Lydia was a woman of modest means. Aris's death would leave them nearly bankrupt due to mounting medical bills and the loss of his income. She looked at the man, realizing he represented the very people who might be responsible for the accident that took her husband. If she took the money, she was essentially selling Aris's life to his killers. If she refused, she would struggle for the rest of her life, and the senator would die, perhaps taking the hope of thousands of other families with him. She thought of her 7-year-old daughter sleeping in the waiting room. Was it better to be a martyr for the truth or a provider for the living? Lydia felt the weight of the pen in her hand. It felt heavier than a mountain. Arthur Sterling, the man in the charcoal suit who had approached Lydia, sat in the back of a black sedan. At 65, Arthur had spent his life smoothing over the irregularities of the city's elite. He was the man you called when a body needed to disappear or a scandal needed to be drowned in cash. He had always viewed his work as a necessary evil, a way to maintain the equilibrium of a chaotic world. But tonight, the equilibrium was broken. The Ascent Tower data Marcus Vane was hiding wasn't just a manufacturing defect. It was a deliberate cost-cutting measure sanctioned by the board Arthur served. He knew that the senator's life was being traded for silence, and that Julian, the boy in the cell, was the only witness to the truck that had carried the faulty steel, the same truck that had struck Dr. Aris Thorne. Arthur looked at his reflection in the tinted glass. He had a heart condition. He was a patient of the very medical system he was currently sabotaging. If he turned over the evidence of the board's corruption to Tom Vance, the journalist, Arthur would spend his final years in a federal prison. If he didn't, the tower would eventually fall, and the senator would be a puppet for the men who bought his life. He pulled out a burner phone. He had one contact saved, Vance, not the doctor, but the father. He realized that after a lifetime of fixing things for the powerful, he finally had the chance to fix something for the truth. But at 65, was he brave enough to die behind bars? Clara Vane, the architect's daughter, stood in her nursery on the 42nd floor of the Ascent Tower. She was 7 months pregnant, folding tiny yellow onesies. She had noticed the subtle tremors in the building during the last storm, vibrations her father, Marcus, had dismissed as settling. But Clara wasn't just a socialite. She was a materials scientist. She had run her own unofficial tests on the dust from the ventilation shafts. The results were terrifying. The alloy was oxidizing at an impossible rate. She had confronted her father an hour ago, and the look of pure, frozen terror in his eyes had told her everything. He knew, and he was doing nothing. Now Clara faced a harrowing dilemma. If she blew the whistle on her own father's masterpiece, she would destroy him. He was an old man whose heart was tied to his reputation. The scandal would likely kill him before the law even reached him. But if she stayed silent to protect his heart, she was risking the lives of every person in the building, including her unborn child. She picked up her keys. She could flee, save herself and the baby, and let the rest of the world find out when the first crack appeared. Or she could go to the press and be the one to pull the trigger on her father's legacy. She felt the baby kick, a sharp reminder of the future. She realized that being a good daughter might mean becoming a bad person. Senator Robert Hayes opened his eyes in the private wing of St. Jude's. The transplant had been a success. Dr. Alina Vance stood over him, her face a mask of professional exhaustion. The senator was a man of 68, a veteran of 1,000 political wars, and he knew the smell of a special arrangement. As the anesthesia faded, his chief of staff whispered the news. The healthcare bill had passed, largely due to the sympathy vote surrounding his near-death experience. But the staffer also dropped a bombshell. The liver had come from Dr. Eris Thorne, and there were rumors of procedural shortcuts. The senator looked at Alina. He saw the guilt etched in the corners of her mouth. He realized that his life and the health care of millions was built on the potential murder of a good man. If he went public and demanded an investigation into the timing of the transplant, the bill would be challenged, the hospital would be sued into oblivion, and the miracle would become a crime. If he stayed silent, he could use his new lease on life to pass even more radical, life-saving legislation. He could be the greatest senator in a century, fueled by the blood of a man who never got the chance to wake up. He felt the phantom pulse of a liver that didn't belong to him. He had to decide if a stolen life could ever be used to create a righteous world. Tom Vance sat in his parked car outside St. Jude's Hospital, the glowing tip of his cigarette the only light in the cabin. At 64, Tom had seen every kind of corruption, but this was different. He had just received an anonymous tip from a burner phone he suspected belonged to Arthur Sterling, linking the hit and run, the Ascent Tower's structural flaws, and the senator's liver transplant. The documents were a roadmap to a nightmare. The truck that hit Dr. Eris Thorne was carrying illegal, substandard steel intended for the tower's reinforcement, a quiet fix Marcus Vane was attempting. Julian, the boy in jail, hadn't just seen a car. He had seen the corporate logos on the crates that spilled onto the asphalt. Tom looked at the hospital entrance where his daughter, Alina, was currently finishing her shift. If he published this, he would prove Julian's innocence and expose a massive corporate homicide. But he would also reveal that the senator's liver was harvested prematurely to ensure the healthcare bill's success. Alina's career would be the first casualty. She would be stripped of her license and perhaps prosecuted for manslaughter. He was a man who lived for the big story, but the big story was now a noose around his daughter's neck. If he burned the documents, Julian would stay in prison. The tower might eventually fall, but Alina would be safe. He thought of the thousands of children the healthcare bill would save. Was his daughter's life worth more than theirs? Tom felt the weight of the pen. It felt like a dagger. Inside the gleaming offices of the Vane Construction Group, Sarah Miller, a 55-year-old forensic accountant, was working late. Sarah was a woman who found peace in numbers. They didn't lie, and they didn't have hidden motives. But tonight, the ledger was screaming. She had found a series of off-book payments labeled as structural consultation fees, totaling millions of dollars. The trail led directly to Arthur Sterling's shell companies, and more shockingly, to a private account held by Judge Elias Thorne. Sarah realized the judge hadn't just been assigned Julian's case by accident. He had been retained years ago to ensure certain legal challenges against the Ascent Tower never saw the light of day. Sarah was a single mother of 3. She had spent 20 years climbing the corporate ladder to provide for them. If she took this evidence to the authorities, she would lose her job, her pension, and likely her safety. The people involved were powerful enough to make a middle-aged accountant vanish without a trace. She looked at a photo of her children on her desk. Then she looked at the Save the Children gala invitation from the senator's office. The irony was a bitter pill. She could delete the files and accept the loyalty bonus she had been promised next month, or she could dismantle the city's power structure from the inside out. She realized that the most dangerous thing in the world wasn't a gun. It was a woman with a spreadsheet and nothing left to lose. Father Dominic, a 70-year-old priest at the neighborhood cathedral, sat in the dim light of the confessional. A man had just entered the other side, his voice trembling with a familiar, high-stakes terror. It was Marcus Vane. Marcus didn't want absolution, he wanted a witness. He confessed everything, the faulty steel, the cover-up, and the fact that he knew his daughter, Clara, was living in a death trap. Dominic was bound by the absolute seal of the confessional. He could not repeat a single word Marcus said, not even to save the lives of the hundreds of people in the Ascent Tower. But Dominic knew the law of God often clashed with the laws of men. As Marcus left, Dominic saw Silas Thorne, the prison guard, waiting in the pews. Silas looked like a man haunted by ghosts. Dominic realized that he held the keys to a dozen different tragedies, yet his tongue was tied by his vows. If he broke the seal, he would be excommunicated and lose the only life he had known for 50 years. If he kept it, he was an accomplice to a potential massacre. He watched Silas approach the altar, wondering if the guard was about to add another layer to this suffocating web. Dominic looked up at the crucifix, asking for a sign, but the stone eyes offered no escape. He realized that silence wasn't just gold, sometimes it was lead. Inside the county jail, Silas Thorne, the veteran guard, stood before Julian's cell. He had made his decision. He wouldn't let the boy die for a corporate ledger, but Silas was 60 and his knees ached with every step. He knew that reporting the hit wouldn't work. The warden was on the board of Vane Construction. Silas pulled out his heavy ring of keys. He had disabled the security cameras in Block C, claiming a technical glitch. He told Julian to put on a janitor's jumpsuit. It was a desperate old man's plan. If they were caught, Silas wouldn't just lose his pension. He'd spend his remaining years in a cell next to the men he had guarded for decades. His wife, Martha, was waiting in the parking lot in their rusted sedan. She didn't know the boy was coming. Silas felt a pang of guilt. He was dragging her into a felony. But as he looked at Julian's terrified, young face, Silas saw the brother he had once loved, before the law and greed had rotted Elias' soul. They moved through the shadows of the loading dock. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a gunshot. Silas realized that doing the right thing felt exactly like committing a crime. He was trading his future for a stranger's life, and for the first time in 30 years, the weight of the keys in his pocket didn't feel like a burden. They felt like a choice. Marcus Vane returned to his penthouse after his confession to Father Dominic. He found his daughter, Clara, waiting for him. She wasn't crying, she was packed. She held a digital tablet showing the structural scans she had taken. The vibrations in the Ascent Tower weren't settling. They were the sound of microscopic shears in the steel. Marcus tried to lie, but the words died in his throat. He looked at his daughter, the only legacy that truly mattered, and realized he had built her a tomb. "I tried to fix it, Clara," he whispered. "The money, I was using it to buy the reinforcements." Clara looked at him with a coldness that hurt worse than any indictment. "You didn't buy reinforcements, Dad. You bought Judge Thorne's silence. You bought the senator's liver. You bought a boy's imprisonment." She told him she had already sent her findings to a contact at the city's building department, a woman named Sarah Miller. Marcus felt his heart seize. The dominoes were falling. If the building was evacuated now, the panic would cause a market crash that would wipe out the city's pension funds. But if they waited until morning, the tower might hold. He begged her for 12 hours to manage the exit. Clara stood at the door, her hand on her pregnant belly. She had to decide if her father deserved the grace of a controlled fall, or if he needed to be stopped before the sun rose. She walked out, leaving Marcus alone with the sound of the wind whistling through the faulty steel. Sarah Miller sat in her darkened home office, staring at the email from Clara Vane. The data confirmed everything Sarah had found in the ledgers. The structural consultation fees were indeed bribes to cover up the crumbling skeleton of the city's pride. Suddenly her front door creaked. It wasn't the wind. 2 men in dark suits, Arthur Sterling's cleaners, were standing in her hallway. They didn't have guns, they had a folder. Inside were photos of Sarah's youngest son at his soccer practice that afternoon. "We don't want a tragedy, Sarah," one of the men said. His voice was as smooth as silk. "Delete the files, sign the NDA, and your son gets a full scholarship to any university in the country. If you don't, Well, accidents happen in a city with such poor infrastructure. Sarah felt a cold sweat prickle her neck. She was a forensic accountant. She knew the odds. If she fought them, she would lose her son. If she joined them, she would be a wealthy accomplice to a potential mass casualty event. She looked at her laptop. The send button to the Attorney General's office was one click away. She realized that every hero in the stories she read as a child always had something to lose. She just never realized that the something was the only thing that made life worth living. She reached for the mouse, her hand shaking with the force of 1,000 lives. Judge Elias Thorne sat in his empty courtroom at 3 a.m. The silence was deafening. He had just received 2 messages, one from his brother, Silas, confessing to breaking Julian out of jail, and one from Sarah Miller, containing the ledger that proved Elias had taken bribes from Vane Construction. His legacy, the only thing that had filled the void of his empty house, was a lie. He looked at the bench where he had dispensed justice for 30 years. He realized that by trying to protect the boy, Silas had actually handed Elias the ultimate weapon. If Elias presided over the morning's emergency hearing regarding the Ascent Tower, he could dismiss the case against the boy, who was now a fugitive, and redirect the blame toward Marcus Vane, effectively sacrificing the architect to save his own skin. But then he thought of Julian's eyes. They were the eyes of an innocent boy who had spent his life without a father, and now was a hunted criminal because of Elias' greed. If Elias stepped down and confessed, he would go to prison, but the boy would be exonerated and the tower would be evacuated by the proper authorities. If he stayed, he could manipulate the law one last time to stay free, but at the cost of his brother's freedom and the boy's soul. Elias reached into his robe and pulled out a small, silver whistle his father had given him. He realized that a judge who cannot judge himself is no judge at all. He picked up his pen to write his final, honest verdict. Dr. Alina Vance stood in the senator's recovery suite, watching the sunrise. The senator was awake, his skin a healthy hue for the first time in months. He looked at Alina and whispered, "I know what you did, doctor. And I know why you did it. The bill is safe. The children are safe. Let the secret die with Eris." Alina felt a wave of nausea. She had just seen her father, Tom, on the morning news. He was breaking a story about the Ascent Tower, and although he hadn't mentioned the hospital yet, she knew the documents he held contained her name. Her father was choosing the truth over her career. She had a choice. She could destroy the medical records that showed the shortcuts taken during Eris's death, ensuring the senator's legacy remained untarnished and her own license stayed valid. Or she could step forward as a witness for her father's story, confirming that the medical system had been subverted by the same corporate interests that built the crumbling tower. If she spoke, the healthcare bill would likely be repealed in the ensuing scandal. Millions of children would lose their care. If she stayed silent, she was a murderer in a white coat. She looked at the senator, a man she had saved but who was now her accomplice. She realized that sometimes the greater good is just a high-priced coffin for one's conscience. She took off her stethoscope and laid it on the bedside table. Arthur Sterling stood on the roof of the Ascent Tower, watching the blue and red lights of the police cruisers begin to circle the base of the building. Sarah Miller had pushed the button. The evacuation had begun, but it was disorganized and panicked. The cleaners he had sent to her house hadn't returned, and Arthur knew his time was up. He held a briefcase containing the original physical contracts signed by Elias Thorne and Marcus Vane. These were the only pieces of evidence that couldn't be deleted or disputed in court. He could throw them into the industrial incinerator on the roof and walk away into a comfortable, untraceable exile in a country without extradition. Or he could wait for the police to reach the roof and hand over the case. He was 65 with a failing heart. He wouldn't survive a year in prison. But as he looked down at the families pouring out of the lobby, he saw a young woman who looked like Clara Vane, clutching a small child. He thought of all the fixes he had performed over 40 years. None of them had made the world better. They had only made the powerful more comfortable. He realized that his final fix wouldn't be for a client, but for history. He opened the briefcase, making sure the papers were in order, and sat on a concrete bench to wait. For the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of the truth. He was just tired. The rain had turned to a freezing mist as Silas Thorne and Julian reached the city limits. Silas's old sedan was coughing, its heater long dead. Julian sat in the passenger seat, staring at his hands. "Why are you doing this?" the boy whispered. "You don't even know me." Silas looked at the road, his eyes clouded with cataracts and exhaustion. "I knew your mother, Julian. And I know your father, even if he's forgotten what it means to be a man." He knew that by now, the sirens behind them weren't just for the tower evacuation, they were for him. He had stolen a prisoner and assaulted a fellow officer. They pulled into a small, hidden trailhead. Silas handed Julian a thick envelope. It contained his life savings, $30,000, and a map to a cabin across the border. "Go," Silas commanded. Start a life where no one knows the name Thorn. Julian looked at the old man, realization dawning. If I go, you're the one who pays. They'll say you were part of the conspiracy. Silas smiled, a weary, honest expression. They already say that about me, son. I'd rather be a criminal for a good reason than a hero for a lie. He watched Julian disappear into the woods. As the first police cruiser pulled up behind his car, Silas stepped out with his hands raised. He felt a strange lightness. He had lost his pension, his freedom, and his reputation, but for the first time in 60 years, he felt like he was finally standing on solid ground. The sun rose over a city that would never be the same. The Ascent Tower stood empty, a hollow monument to greed, cordoned off by miles of yellow tape. Judge Elias Thorne had been found in his chambers, a signed confession on his desk and the briefcase from Arthur Sterling by his side. The senator had resigned, the health care bill remained in limbo, and Dr. Alina Vance had walked away from the hospital for the last time. Tom Vance sat on a park bench, the morning edition of the newspaper in his hand. The headline he had written was simple: the cost of a foundation. His daughter sat next to him. They didn't speak. Some wounds were too deep for words. He had saved the boy and exposed the corruption, but he had also broken his family. In the distance, the tower remained. It hadn't fallen yet, but the engineers said it was only a matter of time. The city's elite were in ruins, replaced by investigators and lawyers. People walked past the park, looking at the skyline with new, cynical eyes. The moral dilemma of the city had been solved, but the solution left a bitter aftertaste. Everyone had chosen a side, and everyone had paid a price. As the wind picked up, a low, metallic groan echoed from the direction of the tower, the sound of steel finally giving up. Tom looked at Alina and took her hand. They had the truth now, and as the tower finally began its slow, inevitable descent, they realized that the truth was the only thing heavy enough to keep them anchored in the storm.